So why would people matter to us? Where does compassion come from? You can imagine different possibilities. You can imagine people have compassion of a sort just out of selfishness. It might be that your pleasure matters to me because in some way we're in a sort of relationship where you being happy leads to me being happy. Maybe we're sort of business partners working together or something, or we're in some sort of mutual benefit system where your benefit is my benefit and your suffering is my suffering. I'll leave it for a question for later whether this even counts as compassion, but it's one source of nice behavior towards others. We might care about other people because of our religious code. You can imagine we care about other people because we believe that God wishes us to. We might care about other people because we are committed to some philosophical theory of morality of the sort we discussed earlier, like consequentialism or a Kantian theory, in which other people's happiness and feelings and goals matter to us. But many people have argued that a lot of what goes on in compassion comes from our gut, comes from our heart. It's not for self-serving benefit, nor is it because of our belief system, but rather it's because we're wired up to care about other people. And a specific proposal as to what could drive compassion, and some people argue drive morality more generally, is that empathy plays an important role. So let me define empathy. Empathy is based on a German word. The term is a new term. It was coined in the early 1900s, and it means to feel one's way into. And when you think about empathy, you could think of it as being in someone else's shoes, putting yourself out in someone else's shoes. Now, the idea that empathy plays a big role in our morality and our compassion is something, again, you find in Adam Smith. So Adam Smith argues that a sort of foundation for caring about other people is imagining yourself in their shoes. And he gives an example of how this can be done. He says, when we see a stroke aimed and just ready to fall upon the leg or arm of another person, we naturally shrink and draw back our own leg or arm. And when it does fall, we feel it in some measure and are hurt by it as well as the sufferer. Now, once you start looking for examples of how empathetic connection affects you, you can see them all over the place. Here's one of my favorite examples. It's a picture from a wonderful book called Emotional Contagion. And you can see the guy is tensing up in anticipated feeling of the pain of the needle of the child he's holding. And, you know, I saw the movie Casino Royale, a James Bond movie, a little while ago. And there's a scene where our character, James Bond, is shackled naked to a chair and then whapped in the testicles. And me, I think just about every other male in the theater is going, oh, in vicarious pain. But it's not just pain. It's also pleasure. I'll show you one of my favorite YouTube videos. I'll show you a brief clip of it. And this video, I think, is watched so much because it just gives people pleasure.
Blong.
So, what's going on with that? Why would anybody enjoy watching another person laugh? Well, because somehow the happiness of the kid jumps from him to us. And so it's hard to watch a video like that without sort of being cheered up a bit, because we're naturally primed to take on the perspective and feeling of others. And in fact, when people develop theories of empathy, theories drawing upon psychology and neuroscience, they often see it as related to a more general propensity to imitate other people, to be the people we are interacting with. Here's an example of imitation. A soccer player has just missed a big kick, and he puts his hand on both sides of his head. But now look at the people around him. We imitate each other all the time. There are studies showing that when you have two people talking to each other, they'll unconsciously start to imitate the behavior of the other. My wife, when she's with her Texas relatives, she starts to drawl. And in fact, whenever you're talking to somebody with an accent, there's this irresistible temptation to start speaking that accent too. It's part of how we respond to other people. And it shows up, like a lot of what I'm talking about, even in babies. So the developmental psychologist Andrew Meltzoff, many years ago, found that babies are natural mimics. Here's a clip of him making different facial expressions and a baby making those expressions back at him. And you watch a mother or father with a baby, what you'll see is this sort of dance, as it were, where one of them will make an expression, the other one will do it back, and so on. Some people have argued that there's a specific neural system that underlies this imitation, underlies this empathy, known as mirror neurons. And mirror neurons were first discovered with non-human primates. And what they are is they're activated when you do an action, like reach for something, but they're also activated when you observe another individual do the same action. And this suggests that, that at some neural level, there's no distinction between us and them. There's no distinction between you and another person. As we experience imitate the motor movements of another person, you could feel a connection to them. And this imitation could itself drive empathy. So one demonstration of this involves facial expressions. And here the excellent work's been done by the psychologist Paul Ekman. So Paul Ekman points out there are certain universal facial expressions. Humans all around the world have them, and I've shown some of them here. You go around the list there: anger, fear, disgust, sadness, happiness, and surprise. These are universal. But what's interesting is two things. One thing is you'll naturally mimic someone's facial expression. So if you're sitting across from me and I'm frowning, you'll start to frown. Also, when you imitate the expression, due to the facial feedback that ensues, you'll start to feel the same feelings that I'm feeling. So if I'm really happy and I'm grinning like an idiot, you'll start to grin like an idiot. And if you grin like an idiot, it'll make you happy. Some of the most annoying advice you could tell a depressed person is, you should smile more. This is incredibly annoying, but it's true. It's true for two reasons. One is, if you smile, people will smile back at you and they'll like you more. But the second one is, and there's laboratory studies on this, the very act of going like this, of moving the corners of your lips upwards, triggers the feelings typically associated with smiling. That is happiness. And so smiling in some small way boosts your mood. It might be parenthetically that this mirroring of others and our propensity to do so and the pleasure we get from doing so could explain some mysteries of human psychology. And these are mysteries that go quite a bit beyond the questions of morality we're interested in, but I can't resist talking about it here. So I'm going to show you a little clip. I'll show you 1 minute of this clip. And it's from a series of videos called Where the Hell is Matt?, where this sort of nondescript guy dances to music with different people across the world. So I'll show you this clip. It'll last like a minute, 5 seconds. And as you're watching it, monitor firstly, monitor what you're doing. And second, monitor your own feelings. We were all dancing here, me, the camera guys, everybody. That's one thing. One thing is, upon seeing this, you'll be tempted to move with it. This is most extreme in children. My sons and I, when they were younger, we'd watch a lot of kung fu movies together. And they can't watch a kung fu movie without leaping up and kicking people and things and so on. It's just irresistible. But second, not only are you tempted to move with it, but often there's some sort of warm feeling associated with it, some human connection. And this illustrates how other people's movements and your propensity to imitate these movements lead to sort of connections of feelings and connections of positive feelings. And this could be viewed as a manifestation of empathy. So let's step back. You have concern for others. Other people matter to you. And then you have empathy, which is putting yourself in other people's shoes. And you could do empathy through an act of the imagination. You could think, I wonder what it's like to be her, and think about that. I wonder what his experience is like. But you could also do it viscerally, by seeing another person act in some way. The theory worth taking seriously then is that empathy is a spark for compassion. And it's not hard to see how this could work. Let's assume, because it's true and it's kind of obvious, that I don't like feeling pain. And so if I feel pain, I want to stop that. But let's also assume that if I see you in pain, I'll feel your pain, empathy, and I'll want to stop that. Because by stopping you from feeling your pain, I'll stop me from feeling my pain. Suppose I see you happy, and that makes me happy. I'll want more of that because I like being happy. You could say that empathy dissolves the boundaries between yourself and another person. And so this predicts that when you're in an empathetic state with somebody, when you're taking their perspective, you will adopt their interests. You will care about them. You will feel compassion and concern. And there's a fair amount of evidence that this is true. A lot of work comes from the psychologist Dan Batson. And Batson has done dozens of studies, perhaps hundreds of studies by now, where he gets people in a situation where they have to choose whether to help somebody or whether to care about somebody. And he finds that if he can get them to feel empathy, to see it how they feel, to see it how the other person sees it, to feel it as the other person feels it, the odds of them being kind and caring go up. So for instance, you could tell a story about a girl who is in line for a life-saving operation, and there's other people ahead of her. And then if you just ask the person, ask your experimental subject, try to take this girl's perspective. Try to see it as she's seeing it. That raises the odds you're willing to take that girl and move her up to the front of the line, that you're willing to rescue her. Because the shared feelings motivate compassion. They motivate caring. In general, this effect, the fact that empathetic connections with individuals boost up your feelings towards them, is the spark of what's sometimes called the identifiable victim effect. The identifiable victim effect is the idea that we care a lot more when there's a person in front of us than some numbers. And this is something which has been observed by many people. Joseph Stalin apocryphally said, "A single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic." Mother Teresa said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And there's actually experimental work done demonstrating this. So there's a series of wonderful studies done by Deborah Small and Paul Slovic and George Lowenstein, where you give people the facts, you give people data about a crisis involving numbers and hard facts, and you see how much they care and how much they'll donate. And in this example, where they throw a lot of statistics at people, your average person hearing it will give about $1. But then another group, you tell about an individual with a name and with a face. And this bumps it up considerably. There are some studies that find that you will care more and give more to save one person with a name and a face than 5 people, but you're not told their names and you're not shown their faces. And this, I think, shows the power of empathy. Now, nothing that I'm saying would be a surprise to those who spend their lives trying to get people to give to charities. So if you look at the ads for charities, they don't say, okay, here's our charity, here's the statistics, here's the data, here's the graphs, and so on. They'll show you a picture. They'll tell you about an individual. I know this from personal experience. When I was in graduate school, I was extremely persuaded by Peter Singer's argument, which I talked about in a previous lecture, that we need to give much more to charity, that we are doing something wrong by by spending money on luxuries instead of giving the money to save people's lives. I was very persuaded by this, and still am, kinda. And I would tell this to my friends. I'd tell this to my fellow graduate students. And we'd be out for a beer, and we'd be drinking a beer, and I'd say, that beer could save a child's life, and you are murdering a child, me too, by drinking these beers. And at one point, one of my friends who was a graduate student, a philosopher actually, got really sick of me. And he said, how much do you give to charity? And I'm sort of like, well, dude, it's a philosophical argument here. But I thought about it, well, nothing, actually. And I was a poor graduate student, but I was much richer than the people I was concerned about. So I decided I should give money to charity. So I sent away, this is pre-internet, so I sent away a postcard to an organization, Child Reach, and asked for information. And I remember getting the packet, and I remember opening up the packet. And I remember expecting to see a lot of information about what their charity does and how they work and where the money goes and so on. But they were much smarter than that. I opened up the packet, and there in it was a picture, wrapped up in plastic, of a small child. And the letter said, "Dear Mr. Bloom, we know you have not committed to giving us any money. We know you're just asking for information, and that's fair enough. But we have enclosed a picture." And then they told me and they told me the child's name. And they said, "We know you're not committed to giving us money, but if you do give us money, this is the life you will save." And that is psychologically so much more powerful than data and then facts. And actually, my family is still sending money to that child and his family many, many years later. Now, you could argue further that the kindness, the boost we get from empathy can motivate kind behavior, not just to individuals, but to the groups that those individuals belong to. And this is a claim defended by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. So Nussbaum writes, talking about Greek tragedies, although all of the future citizens who saw ancient tragedies were male, they were asked to have empathy for the suffering of many whose lot could never be theirs, such as Trojans and Persians and Africans, such as wives and daughters and mothers. And her argument is that one of the things fiction can do, fiction, also journalism and stories, movies, TV shows, is they can get you to have empathy, put you in the shoes of those who you wouldn't otherwise be with. And by doing so, you might care not just about that individual, that fictitious individual, but rather the group that the individual belongs to. My own bet is that feelings in America towards homosexuals were radically affected by situation comedies like Will and Grace, which showed gay people in a positive way, made you root for them, made you care for them, put yourself in their shoes. Attitudes in America towards African Americans, I think, were transformed by shows like The Cosby Show, which again put people in the shoes of these African Americans who were perfectly fine and fun and enjoyable, and people you could sympathize with, and then the sympathy expanded to the group as a whole. Now, this is largely speculation, but we do know historically that there are cases where fiction has caused interesting and important moral changes. And one example has to do with Harriet Beecher Stowe. The story goes that Abraham Lincoln invited her to the White House at the beginning of the Civil War and said to her, "So you're the little lady who's caused this great big war." And he was talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is not a book of great philosophy or legal reasoning or theology or morality. It's fictional, but what it does is it got the readers, who were predominantly white people, some of whom were slave owners, to put themselves in the shoes of slaves and see what their experience was. And by doing so, served as a catalyst for moral change. So I've argued that empathy could be a force for morality, both at the individual level, but also maybe at the group level too. In further support for this, I think we could look now at precisely what's wrong with people who don't care about other people, people who lack compassion. And this brings us back to psychopaths. So psychopaths, also known as sociopaths, you could use whatever term, they're not sensitive. They're typically male. To be a psychopath is defined by all sorts of characteristics. A clinical psychologist named Hare developed a psychopathy test. If you're curious about yourself, you could take it online. Psychopaths tend to be selfish, they're callous, they're impulsive, they're promiscuous. And they have a deficit in normal feelings. They have a deficit in love, in loyalty, in guilt, in shame, and in anxiety. They tend to be cold-blooded characters. Psychopathy comes in all sorts of flavors. In some extreme cases, you have these cold-blooded psychopaths who are also very violent people, and these people cause so much of the misery in the world. I'll give you a few quotes to give you a feeling for psychopathy. By the way, when you think about psychopaths, you may well think of Hannibal Lecter, who's a classic Silence of the Lambs psychopath. But I tend to think of James Bond, to show you that they're not all necessarily bad guys. Some of the psychopaths might be on our side, but James Bond also fits many of the characteristics. The Daniel Craig James Bond, not the Roger Moore James Bond. So how do psychopaths talk? How do they think? Well, you have these extreme examples. One of them, which was reported by Damon in his book on morality, is of a 13-year-old who would mug blind people. And he'd mug blind people because he figured they couldn't identify him later. And he was then asked later on, don't you care about the people whose lives you destroy, the people you assault? What about this woman you just attacked? And his response, I think, perfectly captures what a person is like without compassion. He said, what do I care? I'm not her. And in some way that's a good argument. You're not her. Why should you care? Well, because humans normally are wired up to care, but it's hard to figure a logical argument why you should. Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer, was once in an interview while in prison, expressed surprise at the fuss that was made about all of his murders. He said at one point, there are so many people. He was kind of puzzled why people were so concerned. And one of the creepier examples, and this is from John Ronson's excellent book, The Psychopath Test, is a guy named Peter Woodcock. And this guy, he had raped and murdered 3 children and ended up in a psychiatric facility for the rest of his life. But he did get a 3-hour leave to walk around the grounds after some years of good behavior. In the course of this, he invited a friend of his who was also on this leave to join him for a walk, and then killed his friend with a hatchet. So he was interviewed later about this event, and here's how he described it. So the interviewer asks, what was going through your mind at that time? This was somebody you loved. And the psychopath answers, curiosity actually, and an anger because he had rebuffed all my advances. And why did you feel someone should die as a result of your curiosity? I just wanted to know what it would feel like to kill somebody. And the interviewer asks, but you had already killed 3 people. And Woodcock replies, yes, but that was years and years and years and years ago. So what's wrong with psychopaths? Well, one answer is that among their many deficits, they don't have normal empathetic feelings towards others. They don't feel other people's pain. They don't feel other people's pleasure. And because of that, the suffering that they cause doesn't come back at them. It doesn't resonate. Some people have argued that along with all of their deficits, including empathetic deficits, there's something very specific that's wrong with them. And this comes from the work of the psychologist Abigail Marsh. So Marsh did a series of studies where she took psychopaths who were in her lab, and she showed them a series of faces. And the idea is you have to identify the face, what emotional expression corresponds to that face. So they would look at the face on the upper left and say, boy, that woman looks angry. And they look at the face of the guy in the middle bottom and say, that's one happy guy. But there was one sort of face that they had a lot of problems recognizing. That is, they would look at that face and they wouldn't have the fuckiest idea what the person was feeling. Though for a normal person, it was obvious. So the face I'm talking about is in the top middle. It's fear. And Marsh argues that psychopaths have a specific deficit empathizing with the fear of other people. She tells a story of a study, an interview with actually a female psychopath who identified all of the faces easily, except had no idea what fear was. And then finally it came to her. And she said, I don't know what that expression is called, but I know it's what people look like right before I stab them. And I'll end with that.